do you like working with the group? And did you ever think you would become an OJ?
It's fantastic, and no, I never thought that I would become an OJ.
It still hurts, man. It's still, you know, it's still, it's almost like rubbing a sore and it start bleeding again as soon as you start rubbing them.
At 83, Eddie Levert reveals the one band member he hated more than anyone, and the $15 million reason why. For over 30 years, the lead singer of the OJs kept his mouth shut about Sammy Strain.
So now it'll be 9 years next year.
Really?
Yeah. People don't realize that. Every time they see me, they said, it's the new guy, but 9 years, you're not new.
Is he new after 9 years? No, not after 9.
No. So I feel as though I've sang with the guys all my life.
But when Strain filed a lawsuit seeking $15 million in 2007, claiming he'd been cheated out of royalties, Eddie's worst suspicions about the man were finally confirmed. This is the story of betrayal, greed, and the man who proved that sometimes your worst enemy is the one you saved. So, let's get into it. In 1976, when William Powell lost his battle with cancer at just 35 years old, the OJs faced their darkest hour. Powell wasn't just the third voice in their harmonies. He was family, a founding member who had been there since the beginning when they were just kids from Canton, Ohio, dreaming of making it big. His death left Eddie Levert and Walter Williams devastated, wondering if the OJs could even continue without their brother.
Well, we got to keep working, which was a really trying period because we came from nowhere to this and we were just beginning to tap the surface.
Then Sammy Strain walked into their lives and everything changed, but not in the way anyone expected. Strain came with impressive credentials. He was a seasoned performer who had cut his teeth with Little Anthony and the Imperials, one of the most respected vocal groups of the era. When he joined the OJs in 1976, he brought experience, professionalism, and a voice that could seamlessly blend with Eddie and Walter's established sound. On paper, it was the perfect match. For a while, it seemed like divine intervention. The OJs didn't just survive Powell's death, they thrived. With Strain's addition, they released some of their biggest hits, including Used to Be My Girl, which became their final top 5 hit. Strain's stage presence was electric, and his energy brought new life to the group's performances. Eddie would later admit, "We became superstars with Sammy because he was such an entertainer. He was such an energetic person. You know when you add that last piece to the puzzle and you're so happy that you finally finished it? That's what he was to the OJs." But success has a way of changing people, and Strain was no exception. As the hits kept coming and the crowds grew larger, something shifted in his attitude. The man who had joined as a replacement began acting like he owned the place. He started making demands about everything from set lists to stage positioning, treating Eddie and Walter like hired hands, rather than the founders who had built the OJs from nothing. The tension began subtly. Strain would question creative decisions that had always been Eddie and Walter's domain. He pushed for more prominent billing, arguing that his name deserved equal weight with the founding members. During recording sessions, he would challenge arrangements and harmonies that the OJs had perfected over nearly 2 decades. What really grated on Eddie was Strain's apparent amnesia about how he'd gotten there in the first place. This wasn't some fresh-faced kid who had worked his way up through the ranks. This was a man who had been handed a spot in one of R&B's most successful groups, and instead of showing gratitude, he acted entitled to everything they had built. The money made it worse. The OJs were at their commercial peak during Strain's tenure, pulling in serious revenue from record sales, tours, and licensing deals. But while Eddie and Walter had sweated through years of poverty and rejection to reach this point, Strain waltzed into their success and immediately began calculating his share of everything. Behind the scenes, Strain was already making moves that would define the next 3 decades of OJ's drama. He was keeping meticulous records of every dollar earned, every song recorded, every performance given. He was building a case for why he deserved equal treatment with the men who had founded the group long before he arrived. Eddie watched it all unfold with growing resentment. Here was a man who had been welcomed into their family during their most vulnerable moment, and he was repaying their trust by trying to rewrite history.
We didn't know what was wrong with him because this was a 360. This was not the person that we grew up with, that we came out of Canton with.
Strain wasn't content to be the third member of the OJs. He wanted to be recognized as an equal partner in something he had never built. The breaking point came gradually, through countless small slights and mounting arrogance. But even as Eddie's hatred for Strain grew, he had to maintain the facade of unity. The OJs were too successful, the money too good, and the fans too loyal to let personal animosity destroy what they had built.
It'll be 9 years next year.
Really?
Yeah. People don't realize that. Every time they see me,
know.
they said, it's the new guy, but 9 years, you're not new.
Is he new after 9 years? No, not after 9.
No. So I feel as though I've sang with the guys all my life.
So Eddie bit his tongue, smiled for the cameras, and sang his heart out night after night, alongside the man he was beginning to despise. But inside, the resentment was building like pressure in a volcano, waiting for the right moment to explode. That moment would come 16 years later, when Strain finally left the group. But even then, Eddie thought the nightmare was over. He had no idea that the worst was yet to come, and that Strain's true nature would reveal itself in a way that would make their years of personal tension look like a friendly disagreement. When Sammy Strain left the OJs in 1992 to rejoin Little Anthony and the Imperials, Eddie Levert felt nothing but relief. After 16 years of mounting tension, creative disputes, and personality clashes, the third chair was finally empty. Eddie and Walter could return to what the OJs had always been, a brotherhood built on mutual respect and shared sacrifice. For 15 years, that's exactly what happened. The OJs continued recording, touring, and maintaining their legacy without Strain's divisive presence. They brought in new members, first Nathaniel Best, and then Eric Nolan Grant, who understood their roles and respected the hierarchy that Eddie and Walter had established decades earlier. Then, in March 2007, the phone rang with news that would shatter any remaining illusions about Sammy Strain's character. Strain had filed a $15 million lawsuit against his former bandmates, claiming he had never received a single penny in royalties during his 16 years with the group. The man who had been welcomed into the OJ's family when they were at their lowest point was now accusing Eddie and Walter of theft, larceny, and conspiracy to deny him his rightful earnings. The lawsuit read like a declaration of war. Strain alleged that Eddie Levert and Walter Williams had conspired to deny him his share of the royalties from hits like Used to Be My Girl and Forever Mine, songs that had earned millions during his tenure with the group. He claimed that during his 16 years with the OJs, when they recorded 11 albums, 3 of which went gold and 2 platinum, he had been systematically cheated out of his fair share. His lawyer, Charles A. Whittier, couldn't resist the theatrical flourish of invoking one of the OJ's biggest hits when he declared, "My client has been stabbed in the back for the love of money." The irony was bitter, using the group's own music to attack the men who had created it. But Strain didn't stop with Eddie and Walter. The lawsuit also named renowned R&B producers Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff as defendants, along with their label, Philadelphia International Records. He was essentially claiming that the entire Philadelphia International machine, the architects of the sound of Philadelphia, had conspired to cheat him out of millions. Eddie's reaction was immediate and visceral. This wasn't just about money. This was a complete rewriting of history by a man who had been given opportunities he never would have had without the OJs. Strain was positioning himself as the victim of a vast conspiracy, when the truth was far simpler. He had been a replacement member who had been compensated according to his role in the group. The timing of the lawsuit made it even more insulting. Strain had waited 15 years after leaving the group to make these claims. During his entire tenure with the OJs, through all their personal conflicts and creative disputes, he had never once mentioned being cheated out of royalties. It was only after he was gone, after the statute of limitations on some of the earnings had expired, that he suddenly discovered this massive conspiracy against him. What made Eddie's blood boil was the ingratitude of it all. The OJs had rescued Strain from relative obscurity and given him the biggest platform of his career. His work with Little Anthony and the Imperials had been successful, but it was his time with the OJs that had elevated him to true stardom. Now he was repaying that opportunity by trying to destroy the very people who had made it possible. The lawsuit revealed the depth of Strain's resentment and his distorted view of his own importance to the group. In his mind, he wasn't just a replacement member. He was an equal partner who had been systematically denied his rightful place in OJ's history. He seemed to genuinely believe that his 16 years with the group entitled him to the same treatment as Eddie and Walter, who had been building the OJs since 1958. For Eddie, this was the final confirmation of everything he had suspected about Strain's character during their years together. The arrogance, the entitlement, the lack of respect for the group's history. It had all been leading to this moment when Strain would try to cash in on their success through the courts. The lawsuit also exposed Strain's calculating nature. This wasn't an emotional outburst or a sudden realization of being wronged. This was a carefully planned legal strategy that had been years in the making. Strain had been documenting everything, building his case while still performing with the group, preparing for the day when he could make his move. The betrayal cut deep because it came from someone who had been trusted with the OJ's most sacred trust: their music, their legacy, and their brotherhood. Eddie had always known that Strain was difficult, but he had never imagined that the man would one day try to destroy everything the OJs had built together. As the legal battle began, Eddie realized that his hatred for Strain had been completely justified. This wasn't just about personality conflicts or creative differences. This was about a fundamental lack of character that had finally revealed itself in the most destructive way possible. The $15 million lawsuit unleashed a legal war that would consume the OJs for years and expose just how deep the music industry's financial problems really ran. But for Eddie Levert, Sammy Strain's betrayal was just the beginning of a nightmare that would nearly destroy everything he had spent his life building. As news of Strain's lawsuit spread through the music industry, it triggered a domino effect that would ultimately pit the OJs against their own record label and the legendary producers who had made them superstars. In 2008, just 1 year after Strain's bombshell filing, Eddie and Walter found themselves filing their own lawsuit. This time against Philadelphia International Records and the iconic duo of Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff. The irony was devastating. Gamble and Huff were the architects of the OJ's greatest success, the men who had transformed them from a struggling regional act into international superstars. These were the same producers who had written and produced classics like Backstabbers, Love Train, and For the Love of Money. Now Eddie was accusing them of theft, larceny, and misappropriation of royalties. The OJ's lawsuit sought $3 million in back payments and punitive damages, claiming that Philadelphia International had systematically withheld royalties that were rightfully theirs. According to the court papers, the label had kept $47,000 that it owed the OJs, claiming it would go to pay their legal bill in another matter, then blamed their parent company, Sony Music, for the shortfall. For Eddie, this legal battle represented the ultimate corruption of everything the OJs had stood for. Music had always been about brotherhood, creativity, and shared dreams, Now, it had devolved into a series of lawsuits where former friends and collaborators were accusing each other of theft and betrayal. The response from Gamble and Huff was swift and cutting. In a statement released through their public relations firm, they expressed shock at the lawsuit, noting that only days before Mr. Gamble had exchanged New Year's greetings with the OJ's founding members Eddie Levert and Walt Williams, and the filing of a lawsuit had never come up. Even more damaging was their counter-accusation. We believe their claims boiled down to nothing more than a contract dispute for higher royalties. To the contrary, we expect that the facts will show that rather than being owed anything, the OJs have been overpaid. The word overpaid hit Eddie like a slap in the face. Here were the men who had built their own legacy on the back of OJ's hits, who had earned millions from songs that Eddie's voice had made immortal, claiming that the group had actually received too much money over the years. But the legal chaos was just part of Eddie's torment during this period. As the lawsuits dragged on, he was simultaneously dealing with personal tragedies that would have broken a lesser man. In 2006, his son Gerald died from an accidental overdose of prescription medications at just 40 years old. Gerald had been a successful R&B artist in his own right, and Eddie had cherished their musical collaborations. Then, in 2008, while the legal battles were raging, Eddie received news that would devastate him completely. His younger son Sean had died in police custody at age 39, suffering fatal withdrawal symptoms from Xanax after being jailed for unpaid child support. The authorities had denied Sean his prescribed medication, and he died in a restraining chair after 6 days of hallucinations and medical neglect. The cruelty of the timing was unbearable. Eddie was fighting to protect his musical legacy while simultaneously burying his children. The man who had given his voice to songs about love, family, and brotherhood was watching his own family disintegrate, while former friends and collaborators circled like vultures. Through it all, Sammy Strain's lawsuit continued to hang over everything like a dark cloud. The man who had started this legal avalanche was probably somewhere counting his money and planning his next move, completely oblivious to the destruction his greed had unleashed. For Eddie, Strain represented everything that was wrong with the music industry. He was the embodiment of entitlement, greed, and ingratitude. Someone who had been given opportunities beyond his wildest dreams and had repaid that generosity with betrayal and legal warfare. The most bitter irony was that Strain had actually been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame along with the OJs in 2005. While original founding member Bill Iles was left out of the ceremony, Strain was celebrated as part of the group's legacy. Now, just 2 years later, he was trying to destroy that same legacy through the courts. As Eddie entered his 80s, still performing and still fighting legal battles, he carried the weight of all these betrayals. The music industry had taken everything from him: his sons, his friendships, his faith in human nature, and still demanded more. But perhaps the most painful realization was that his hatred for Sammy Strain had been completely justified from the beginning. Every instinct that had told him not to trust the man, every moment of tension and conflict during their 16 years together had been validated by Strain's ultimate betrayal. Eddie had spent decades trying to be the bigger man, trying to maintain professional relationships despite personal animosity. Now, as he looked back on his life and career, he could finally speak the truth. Sammy Strain was the one band member he hated more than anyone, and that hatred had been earned through years of arrogance, entitlement, and ultimate betrayal. But Eddie's story didn't begin with lawsuits and betrayal. The OJs were born from a shared dream in the heart of the South, where a young boy from Bessemer, Alabama would learn that the music industry demanded everything, and then some. Born on June 16, 1942, Eddie's journey started when his family moved to Canton, Ohio. When he was just 6 years old, the church became his sanctuary, where his voice first found its power in the choir, captivating audiences with a soulful sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his years. By high school, that voice had attracted a group of classmates who shared his hunger for something bigger than their small Ohio town. Eddie teamed up with Walter Williams, William Powell, Bobby Massey, and Bill Isles to form the Triumphs. They played every gig they could find: sock hops, opening acts, any stage that would have them. Their hustle paid off when they traveled to Cincinnati and impressed King Records president Sid Nathan, who signed them on the spot and renamed them the Mascots. The early years were brutal. By the 1960s, they had released singles like Lonely Drifter. But commercial success remained elusive. Frustration grew like a cancer in the group. Bobby Massey and Bill Isles couldn't handle the uncertainty and left, reducing them to a trio: Eddie, Walter, and William Powell. Everything changed in 1972 when they became the OJs and partnered with Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff in Philadelphia. Their first collaboration, Backstabbers, launched them into stardom. Then came Love Train, an anthem that united a divided nation. But success came with a price tag Eddie never anticipated. The spotlight was harsh, and behind the scenes, personal demons were already stirring. The first real blow came in 1975 when William Powell was diagnosed with colon cancer. This wasn't just losing a bandmate. Powell was family, a founding member who had been there since those early days in Canton. He fought valiantly, performing when his body allowed, but by 1976 he had to step away. Sammy Strain replaced him, but Powell's absence left a wound that never healed. Powell died on May 26, 1977, at just 35 years old. His death marked more than the loss of a friend. It was the beginning of Eddie's understanding that the music industry took everything you loved and demanded you keep singing anyway. Years later, even Walter Williams faced his own battle when he was diagnosed with spinal stenosis in 2009, a condition that threatened to end his performing career.
There was no meds that was actually helping. Different methods were tried with steroids like prednisone and Motrin.
Walter took a hiatus in 2010, fighting his way back to the stage through intensive therapy. But for Eddie, watching his oldest friend and musical partner struggle was another reminder of how fragile everything really was. These were the lessons that prepared Eddie for what was coming. The understanding that in the music business, even your closest allies could become your enemies, and the people you trusted most might be the ones who hurt you deepest. The greatest tragedy of Eddie's life wasn't the betrayals or the lawsuits. It was watching his own legacy crumble in the most personal way possible. In 1984, when his sons, Gerald and Sean, announced they wanted to follow his footsteps, Eddie felt the pride every father dreams of. Both boys were still in high school, but their passion was undeniable. Gerald and Sean formed Levert with their friend Mark Gordon, and Eddie watched with amazement as they achieved what he had always hoped for them. 4 of their 7 albums went platinum, making them stars in their own right. The collaboration between father and sons became something magical. In 1992, Eddie and Gerald recorded Baby Hold On To Me, which hit #1 on the R&B charts. 3 years later came the father and son album featuring Already Missing You, which climbed to #7. Then, in 1996, they released Wind Beneath My Wings, reaching #30 on the charts. These weren't just songs, they were memories frozen in time, moments when Eddie felt like he had achieved something more valuable than any hit record. But the music industry that had given Eddie everything was about to take away what mattered most. In 2006, Gerald died at just 40 years old from a fatal interaction of prescription medications. The son who had carried on his musical legacy was gone, leaving Eddie to face every parent's worst nightmare. 2 years later, while Eddie was still drowning in grief, tragedy struck again. Sean died in jail at 39, detained for unpaid child support. His death came from a medical emergency that raised serious questions about the care he received in custody. The cruelty of losing both sons within 2 years broke something inside Eddie that would never heal. In a 2011 interview, his pain was raw and honest. Spend time with those kids. At the end of the day, if something happens to them, you're going to hurt, but you won't have regret. I'm still grieving. I don't think I'm ever going to get past that. At 83, Eddie Levert stands as the last man standing from a lifetime of battles. He survived the betrayal of Sammy Strain, the man who repaid the OJ's generosity with a $15 million lawsuit. He's endured the heartbreak of losing William Powell to cancer, watching his best friend Walter Williams fight through illness, and burying 3 of his own children. The irony isn't lost on him. He spent 16 years hating Sammy Strain for his arrogance and entitlement, only to discover that his instincts had been right all along. Strain's ultimate betrayal through the courts was just the final confirmation of what Eddie had known in his gut from the beginning. Some people take everything you give them and still demand more. But perhaps that's the real tragedy of Eddie Levert's story. In an industry built on harmony and collaboration, he learned that the people closest to you can inflict the deepest wounds. Strain taught him that even family can become enemies. The legal battles with Gamble and Huff showed him that business partnerships mean nothing when money is involved. And life itself taught him the cruelest lesson of all, that success can't protect the people you love. Yet Eddie Levert is still here, still singing, still carrying the weight of the OJ's legacy on his shoulders. His voice may be older, his body may be tired, but his story isn't over. He's lived long enough to see his hatred of Sammy Strain validated, his fears about the music industry proven correct, and his worst nightmares about loss come true. Anyway, that's it for this video, folks. Bye.